Hello, I am Aabir and this is the water cycle. The water cycle doesn't really start anywhere, but let's start at the lake. A lake is a low area on the ground where water collects in pools. Water is coming into the area faster than it leaves, so it backs up, forming a lake. Artificial lakes can be made by people putting a dam on a river, creating a reservoir. Lakes are surrounded by higher land on some sides of it, like a valley. Rain that falls and snow that melts on the higher land alongside a lake flows down the hills as runoff into the lake. Water also seeps into the ground alongside the lake and flows downhill through underground, contributing water to the lake. Let's say I heated up the lake using the sun. The sun is so powerful that even from 90 million miles away, it still affects the water at a molecular level. If only we could see the molecules up close. There we go. Now let's see, if I heat the molecules with the sun, they start vibrating and explode. Just kidding. Water is a chemical composition of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, or H2O. 1 molecule of water is not enough for you to sense. You need lots of them stringed together. Each molecule attracts each other because of the hydrogen's positive charge and the oxygen's negative charge. Positive and negative attract each other, like opposites. If you have a lot of molecules together, you might be able to make liquid, which you can sense. What would really happen is that they evaporate. This is what happens when water gets affected by heat. It turns from a liquid to a gas and floats in the air. It floats in the air because of how light the hydrogen molecules are. Sadly, you cannot see this vapor, but it comes from a lot of places. For example, they can come from volcanoes, where they don't actually have water, but they have the chemicals to make them. 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. And as soon as they get in the air, they mix and make water vapor. Or the water in the ocean, which leaves its salt behind. Even the water that soaks up onto the shore eventually gets evaporated. One special way of evaporation is called evapotranspiration. This is when the water that trees or plants give off evaporates. Transpiration is the process of water movement through a plant and its evaporation from aerial parts such as leaves, stems, and flowers. Although water is necessary for the plant, only a small part of it taken up by the roots is used for the plant. A lot of it is lost in transpiration. In fact, 97% of it is lost through pores in the plant that give off water. One thing you might be wondering about is how ice evaporates in the mountains. The temperature rarely goes above water's freezing point, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 0 degrees Celsius. What happens here is called sublimation. The sun becomes so powerful that it skips the melting phase and goes straight to evaporation. This happens usually on clear days in the mountains where the sun is at its strongest. We have now come to the second or first or third. Well, it doesn't really start anywhere. We're just farther into the water cycle. Now you must be thinking about rain. Since water can turn from a liquid to a gas, it can turn from gas to a liquid, right? Well, hold your horses, except for that water part. What happens next is exactly what you said. Well, partially. Water goes in the air and it rises and rises because of its hydrogen atoms. But at one point it gets too cold. Like as you have seen, when water gets affected by heat, it turns into a gas. So when water gets super cold, it turns back into a liquid. This is how clouds are formed, and it's all from the help of the sun. This is what we call condensation. It must be really fun being a big, fluffy cloud, right? You're so light that you float in the air all the time. Well, wrong. At least about the light part. Water has weight, but it floats in the air because it is lighter than the air. Like if you pour oil in water, what goes to the top? The oil, because it is lighter than a water. Water is lighter than the air around it because of its hydrogen atoms. The hydrogen atoms act like hot air balloons and let it float up to the sky, eventually condensing and becoming a cloud. And clouds really weigh a lot. According to the NOAA, your average cumulus cloud, 1 kilometer on a side, weighs 998 kilograms. That's a lot. Okay, so maybe you weigh a little bit, but you're going up in the air and stop! Hammer time. Well, we didn't really stop for hammer time, but we stopped for a water reason. Fog is a type of cloud that forms near the ground. As you know, clouds form when water vapor condenses because it gets cold. Well, what if the air near the land was cold? Then the water would condense, making a cloud, or fog. Hawaiian Islands sometimes get a significant amount of water from this on their non-rainy days because fog forms and gives dew to the plants. Anyway, back to being a cloud in the air. So you're high in the air, and the air is cold, that's why you became water in the first place. But water can freeze, and sometimes that actually happens. Ice clouds happen when the water in clouds freeze, creating ice cloud. A lot of ice clouds can be artificially made through jets, leaving stuff behind. Being a cloud might be a lot like riding a steamboat into the ocean, going wherever you want to go. Except you can't control where you're going. And the atmosphere's winds are pretty uncontrollable and super fast because of the sun's heat warming the winds up. Sometimes a cloud gets too much water, and since clouds have other things like dust than just water, water will stick to the dust and form droplets, eventually becoming rain, hail, sleet, or snow. This is what we call precipitation. Water from the air falls down to the ground. So, why does rain fall? Gravity. So, when rain hits the ground, it still obeys the laws of gravity, always flowing down, creating runoff. Rivers and stream flows include this. When rain falls, rivers rise. But when snow falls, what happens? Rivers may rise, but sometime after the snow falls, when the snow melts. This is what we call snow melt, when snow or ice melts and contributes water to runoff. Snow melt can be pretty harsh. A sudden rush of water into a river, even though it's after the rain, it can cause a lot of water to suddenly go into the river, overflowing it and causing a flood. Even though rivers can sometimes be very harsh, they are very important to our lives. Look around in this picture. Do you see any desert-like things? No, everything around it is green, full of life. That is why rivers are so important. Lots of things depend on rivers for living. In the end, rivers, streams, and any other water source flowing down is what we call runoff. Runoff usually ends in the ocean, but it can end up in lakes or ponds. Have you ever watered your plants and wondered where the water went in the ground? Well, this is called seepage or infiltration. This happens when water goes into the ground and recharges groundwater. Groundwater is the water underground. You can't see it, but there's always at least some under the ground. Water falls into the ground due to gravity, and sometimes it flows sideways, coming out of the ground and fueling lakes, rivers, streams, and other bodies of water. If you ever dig down far enough, you will find water at some point. No matter how little or how much, there will be water there. That is called groundwater. This happens because water goes into the ground due to gravity and stays there. Wells are made this way to pump groundwater out of the ground. At one point, the land will get so hot that water cannot be underground in a liquid form. Speaking of wells, humans have done very little, but still something to change the water cycle. Wells bring up water for humans. Water parks, as you see in this one, bring water up for entertainment. People also build dams and reservoirs for their own drinking use. Speaking of water coming up from the ground, this can also happen naturally. Springs and plant uptake are examples of this. Springs happen when groundwater finds a way out of the ground, no matter how much or how little. A geyser is a type of spring of built up water shooting out of the ground. Sometimes they can just be pools of water, but it has to be from the ground. Sometimes springs can be heated because of the rocks underground are heating the water. Plant uptake happens when a plant's roots takes water from the ground, fighting against gravity. They bring this water up and use it for their own health. At one point, groundwater can't go down anymore just because the rocks don't give them enough space. So, instead of going down, they go sideways. This is what we call groundwater flow. At one point, the groundwater flow finds its way out of the ground and empties itself somewhere, like you see in the spring. Sometimes they can come out into the ocean through vents. The ocean actually gets some of its salt this way. Let's talk about oceans. They're actually 96% of all water in the world and the largest reservoir of water in the world. They can make currents that actually help water get everywhere. Europe would be a lot colder without the Gulf Stream because it pushes warm water towards Europe. This is just one example of how the ocean helps us a lot, even though we can't drink it. So, what did we learn today? The water cycle never ends, so even though we drink some water, it might come back to us some other day. But that doesn't mean we can always use water however we want. Polluting water is one way that we have hurt the water cycle. This makes the water undrinkable, and other animals too die from it. You can't just use water for your own use. In fact, not many water on this earth is actually drinkable for us. Lots of it is locked up in ice, if not under the ground. Water is always moving, either condensing, evaporating, or precipitating. This is what we call the water cycle. It always goes round and round. It's the end of this video, but not the end of the water cycle. I hope you liked watching it. Bye!